Much later, when he went to bed, Will opened the bedroom curtains and pressed his nose against the cold window pane, and he saw the snow tumbling down, even thicker than before. 2 or 3 inches already lay on the sill, and he could almost watch the level rising as the wind drove more against the house. He could hear the wind, too, whining round the roof close above him, and in all the chimneys. Will slept in a slant-roof attic at the top of the old house. He had moved into it only a few months before, when Stephen, whose room it had always been, had gone back to his ship after a leave. Until then, Will had always shared a room with James. Everyone in the family shared with someone else. "But my attic ought to be lived in," his eldest brother had said, knowing how Will loved it. On a bookcase in one corner of the room now stood a portrait of Lieutenant Stephen Stanton, R.N., looking rather uncomfortable in dress uniform, and beside it a carved wooden box with a dragon on the lid, filled with letters he sent Will sometimes from unthinkably distant places in the distant parts of the world. They made a kind of private shrine. The snow flurried against the window, with a sound like fingers brushing the pane. Again, Will heard the wind moaning in the roof, louder than before. It was rising into a real storm. He thought of the tramp, and wondered where he had taken shelter. "The walker is abroad. This night will be bad." He picked up his jacket and took the strange iron ornament from it, running his fingers round the circle up and down, the inner cross that quartered it. The surface of the iron was irregular, but though it showed no sign of having been polished, it was completely smooth in a way that reminded him of a certain place in the rough stone floor of the kitchen, where all the roughness had been worn away by generations of feet turning to come round the corner from the door. It was an odd kind of iron, deep, absolute black, with no shine to it, but no spot anywhere of discoloration or rust. And once more now it was cold to the touch. So cold this time that Will was startled to find it numbing his fingertips. Hastily he put it down. Then he pulled his belt out of his trousers, slung untidily as usual over the back of a chair, took the circle and threaded it through like an extra buckle, as Mr. Dawson had told him. The wind sang in the window frame. Will put the belt back in his trousers and dropped them on the chair. It was then, without warning, that the fear came. The first wave caught him as he was crossing the room to his bed. It halted him stock still in the middle of the room, the howl of the wind outside filling his ears. The snow lashed against the window. Will was suddenly deadly cold, yet tingling all over. He was so frightened that he could not move a finger. In a flash of memory he saw again the lowering sky over the spinney, dark with rooks, the big black birds wheeling and circling overhead. Then that was gone, and he saw only the tramp's terrified face and heard his scream as he ran. For a moment, then, there was only a dreadful darkness in his mind, a sense of looking into a great black pit. Then the high howl of the wind died, and he was released. He stood shaking, looking wildly round the room. Nothing was wrong. Everything was just as usual. The trouble, he told himself, came from thinking. It would be all right if only he could stop thinking and go to sleep. He pulled off his dressing gown, climbed into bed, and lay there looking up at the skylight and the slanting roof. It was covered gray with snow. He switched off the small bedside lamp, and the night swallowed the room. There was no hint of light, even when his eyes had grown accustomed to the dark. Time to sleep. Go on, go to sleep. But although he turned on his side, pulled the blankets up to his chin, and lay there, relaxed, contemplating the cheerful fact that it would be his birthday when he woke up, nothing happened. It was no good. Something was wrong. Will tossed uneasily. He had never known a feeling like this before. It was growing worse every minute, as if some huge weight were pushing at his mind, threatening, trying to take him over, turn him into something he didn't want to be. That's it, he thought, make me into someone else, but that's stupid. Who'd want to? And make me into what? Something creaked outside the half-open door, and he jumped, and then it creaked again, and he knew what it was, a certain floorboard that often talked to itself at night with a sound so familiar that usually he never noticed it at all. In spite of himself, he lay still, listening. A different kind of creak came from farther away, in the other attic, and he twitched again, jerking so that the blanket rubbed against his chin. "You're just jumpy," he said to himself. You're remembering this afternoon, but really there isn't much to remember. He tried to think of the tramp as someone unremarkable, just an ordinary man with a dirty overcoat and worn-out boots, but instead, all he could see once more was the vicious diving of the rooks. The walker is abroad. Another strange, crackling noise came, this time above his head in the ceiling, and the wind whined suddenly loud, and Will sat bolt upright in bed and reached in panic for the lamp. The room was at once a cozy cave of yellow light, and he lay back in shame, feeling stupid. Frightened of the dark, he thought. How awful, just like a baby. Stephen would never have been frightened of the dark up here. Look, there's the bookcase and the table, the 2 chairs and the window seat. Look, there are the 6 little square riggers of the mobile hanging from the ceiling, and their shadows sailing over there on the wall. Everything's ordinary. Go to sleep. He switched off the light again, and instantly everything was even worse than before. The fear jumped at him for the 3rd time like a great animal that had been waiting to spring. Will lay terrified, shaking, feeling himself shake, and yet unable to move. He felt he must be going mad. Outside the wind moaned, paused, rose into a sudden howl, and there was a noise, a muffled scraping thump against the skylight in the ceiling of his room. And then, in a dreadful, furious moment, horror seized him like a nightmare made real. There came a wrenching crash with a howling of the wind, and suddenly, much louder and closer, and a great blast of cold, and the feeling came hurtling against him with such force of dread that it flung him cowering away. Will shrieked. He only knew it afterwards. He was far too deep in fear to hear the sound of his own voice. For an appalling pitch-black moment he lay scarcely conscious, lost somewhere out of the world, out in black space. And then there were quick footsteps up the stairs outside his door, and a voice calling in concern, and blessed light warming the room and bringing him back into life again. It was Paul's voice. "Will, what is it? Are you all right?" Suddenly Will opened his eyes. He found that he was clenched into the shape of a ball, with his knees drawn up tight against his chin. He saw Paul standing over him, blinking anxiously behind his dark-rimmed spectacles. Will nodded, without finding his voice. Then Paul turned his head, and Will followed his looking, and saw that the skylight in the roof was hanging open, still swaying with the force of its fall. There was a black square of empty night in the roof, and through it the wind was bringing in a bitter midwinter cold. On the carpet below the skylight lay a heap of snow. Paul peered at the edge of the skylight frame. "Catch is broken. I suppose the snow was too heavy for it. Must have been pretty old anyway. The metal's all rusted. Let's get some wire and fix it up till tomorrow. Did it wake you? Lord, what a horrible shock. If I were up like that, you'd find me somewhere under the bed." Will looked at him in speechless gratitude and managed a watery smile. Every word in Paul's soothing, deep voice brought him closer back to reality. He sat up in bed and pulled back the covers. Dad must have some wire with that junk in the other attic," Paul said. "But let's get this snow out before it melts. Look, there's more coming in. I bet there aren't many houses where you can watch the snow coming down on the carpet." He was right. Snowflakes were whirling in through the black square in the ceiling, scattering everywhere. Together they gathered what they could find into a misshapen snowball on an old magazine, and Will scuttled downstairs to drop it in the bath. Paul wired the skylight back to its catch. "There now," he said briskly, and though he did not look at Will, for an instant they understood one another very well. "Tell you what, Will, it's freezing up here. Why don't you go down to our room and sleep in my bed, and I'll wake you when I come up later. Or I might even sleep up here, and if you can survive Robin's snoring, all right?" "All right," said Will huskily. "Thanks." He picked up his discarded clothes, with the belt and its new ornament, and bundled them under his arm, then paused at the door as they went out and looked back. There was nothing to see now except a dark, damp patch on the carpet where the heap of snow had been, but he felt colder than the cold air had made him, and the sick, empty feeling of fear still lay in his chest. If there had been nothing wrong, beyond being frightened of the dark, he would not for the world have gone down to take refuge in Paul's room. But as things were, he knew he could not stay alone in the room where he belonged, for when they were cleaning up the heap of fallen snow, he had seen something that Paul had not. It was impossible, in a howling snowstorm, for anything living to have made that soft, unmistakable thud. against the glass that he had heard just before the skylight fell, but buried in the heap of snow he found the fresh black-winged feather of a rook. He heard the farmer's voice again. "This night will be bad, and tomorrow will be beyond imagining."